Good evening, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Instituto Cervantes. This is a very special year for the Spanish-speaking world. Not only are we celebrating the 400th anniversary of the death of Miguel de Cervantes, but also the centenary of the death of the great Nicaraguan poet Rubén Darío, undisputed father of the modernismo literary movement. It is a great pleasure for us to organize this lecture and poetry reading in memory of Rubén Darío, jointly with the Embassy of Nicaragua and Canning House. We will proceed first with the poetry reading, and it's my pleasure to welcome British actors Kevin Howarth, Glenn McCready, and Spanish actor Jorge de Juan, who will be reading the following poems: Yo persigo una forma primaveral, lo fatal. And then after the poetry reading, we will have our guest speaker, Ian Gibson, giving the lecture in memory of Rubén Darío. And without further ado, I hand over to Her Excellency, the Nicaraguan Ambassador, Giselle Morales Echeverry. Thank you very much.
Good evening, Your Excellencies, members of the Diplomatic Corps, special guests, Professor Ian Gibson, my friends actors here, ladies and gentlemen. To commemorate the 100 years of the transition to immortality of Rubén Darío, Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega signed an executive decree proclaiming the 2006 the year of Darío to celebrate him in his native Nicaragua, the country of the sun that shines new victories, and internationally through our diplomatic representations. The tribute of the poet's death began with the Rubén Darío 14th International Symposium in León, Nicaragua, attended by director of the Royal Academy of the Spanish Language and directors of language academies from several countries. Throughout the Hispanic world, Darianos have lectured on his influence and presence in the Spanish American poetry today, and his life and work has been celebrated. Today, we are also here paying homage to the eternal and universal poet with Rubén 100 años, lecture by Ian Gibson, a celebrated Irish author and Hispanist, known for his biographies of Antonio Machado, Salvador Dalí, Henry Spencer, and particularly for his work of Federico Garcia Lorca, for which he won awards. His novel, he's the writer of the novel Yo Darío, Memorias Póstumas de un Rey de la Poesía, was published in 2002, and for me, he is the most loyal and beautiful tribute to Darío, who narrates from beyond the truth of his tormented and fascinating life. Written in first person, he began, and I'm trying to quote. I'm sorry, I had to say it in Spanish. Yo morí en la ciudad nicaragüense de León a las 10:18 de la noche del 6 de febrero de 1916, a consecuencias de una cirrosis atrófica del hígado. El alcohol, mi consuelo y mi peor enemigo desde hacía décadas, se había salido con la suya. Acababa de cumplir los 49 años y era el poeta más famoso del mundo hispánico y, no creo que sea inmodestia, el más querido. We are here to remember Rubén, padre y maestro mágico, liróforo celeste, leader of a seminal and foundational revolution, according to Nobel laureates Mario Vargas Llosa and Octavio Paz, by transforming and innovating the poetic art. Rubén started a literary liberating movement in the Americas hemisphere. In Dilucidaciones, he bluntly expressed, the art is not a set of rules, but an harmony of caprice. Questioning styles, shapes, and aesthetics of literary creation, with his metrics and thematics innovation, he began to follow the path of rebellion and romance, seeking beauty and perfection. his poetry, his way of dealing with the creative process of translating the reality and what belongs to the world of dreams made him the founder of a new horizon, modernism. With him in his intellectual revolution of the language were top Hispanic writers and poets, among many others, José Martí, Manuel Gutiérrez, Salvador Díaz Mirón, Amado Nervo, José Santos Chocano, Salvador Rueda, los hermanos Machado, Valle Inclán, Francisco Villaespesa, and Juan Ramón Jiménez. We celebrate today to Ruben, the one who Octavio Paz called a hybrid, a rare being, a pre-Columbian idol, hippogriff, the one who Neruda and Garcia Lorca named Minotaur, in their joint homage to Darío Discurso al Limón, because of the variety of his spiritual influence and for the mix of blood running through his veins. We pay tribute to Darío, the one that combines poetry and diplomacy, holding posts in America and Europe, the journalist, aware of his time, who in 1893 published an article entitled The Insurrection in Cuba, referring to Martí, and as an apostle of the revolution, who expressed in his ode to Roosevelt his vision and concerns about the fate of Latin America, the one that in September 2012 wrote for La Nación of Argentina a synthesis of the history of foreign interventions in Nicaragua, the one that in the context of the First World War in February 1915 at the University of Columbia read his poem Pax. To Darío, universal Argonaut, who sang to Verlaine and Whitman, but also exalted Montezuma, the Inca, Nezahualcóyotl, and Caupolicán. Who believe in the Quixote of Cervantes and published the ode to the liberator Simón Bolívar, a Ruben that loved Chile and Argentina as his homeland and left fond memories of his literary art during his time in the Central American countries, France, and La España de su Francisca, his last love. To Darío, the son of El Güehuense and the Spanish lion that always came back to his beloved country, whose lakes and skies, according to Miguel Ángel Asturias and Juan Varela, were evoked in his first book, Azul, considered the birth certificate of modernism. About Darío, Jorge Luis Borges wrote, todo lo renovó Darío, la materia, el vocabulario, la métrica, la magia peculiar de ciertas palabras, la sensibilidad del poeta y de sus lectores. Su labor no ha cesado ni cesará. Quienes algunas veces lo combatimos, comprendemos hoy que lo continuamos. Lo podemos llamar libertador. In recognition of Ruben, the liberator of the words and Hispanic language, on February 6 this year, the day that marked his entry into eternity, the National Assembly of Nicaragua declared him national hero. Now he is alongside the great men who make up our national epic and whose actions and historical thought shape our future. I wanted to express my immense gratitude to the Ambassador of Spain, His Excellency Fernando Trillo Figueroa Martínez Conde, to Julio Crespo and Frances Puertola of the Cervantes Institute for hosting without hesitation this tribute to commemorate the centenary of the death of the Nicaraguan poet Rubén Darío. I want to thank you to Canning House, who also for his strong support. Thank you to Ian Gibson for his loyalty to Ruben, finding time to share his love and knowledge of Darío, the universal poet. Thanks to my dear friends and actor Kevin Howard, Glenn McCready, and Jorge de Juan for bringing us today Ruben poems. Thanks to all of you for joining this tribute to Rubén Darío, the child poet who arrived in Chile at 19 years to become a classic of world literature, prince and father of all of those who speak in Spanish language. Thank you.
Yo persigo una forma que no encuentra mi estilo. Botón de pensamiento que busca ser la rosa. Se anuncia como un beso que en mis labios se posa, el abrazo imposible de la Venus de Milo. Adornan verdes palmas el blanco peristilo. Los astros me han predicho la visión de la diosa y en mi alma reposa la luz, como reposa el ave de la luna sobre un lago tranquilo. Y no hallo sino la palabra que huye, la iniciación melódica que de la flauta fluye y la barca del sueño que en el espacio boga. Y bajo la ventana de mi bella durmiente, el sollozo continuo del chorro de la fuente y el cuello del gran cisne blanco que me interroga.
In spring. Month of roses. My rhymes go round to the vast forest to gather honey and aromas in flowers half opened. Come, my love, the great wood is our temple. There flutters and floats a holy perfume of love. The bird flits from tree to tree, saluting your pretty pink brow like a daybreak. And as you pass, the tall, robust, and proud hollyoaks wave their trembling green leaves and arch their branches the way they would let through a queen. Oh, my love, it's the sweet season of spring.
Look, within your eyes, mine. Give your hair to the wind, and let that ring of light, savage and splendid, bathe the sun. Grant that my hands may squeeze yours of rose and silk, and then laugh, and may your lips reveal their fresh and dewy purple. I will tell you rhymes. You will listen, smiling. If by chance some nightingale should come and perch nearby and tell some story of old about nymphs or roses or stars, you will hear neither trill nor note, but will listen to my songs, smitten and regal, intent on my trembling lips. Oh, my love, it's the sweet season of spring.
Over there, a crystal clear spring bubbles up from a cave where the white nymphs at play are bathing naked. They laugh at the sound of the foam cleaving the serene lymph. In crystalline dust, they sponge their hair. And they know anthems of love in a beautiful Greek tongue that in glorious days of yore Pan invented in the glades. My love, in my rhymes I will place the most superb word of the phrases, of the verses, of the hymns of that tongue. And I will tell you that word, dripping with Hyblean honey. Oh, my love, in the sweet season of spring.
In their vibrating groups, the bees begin circling like a golden whirlwind, which the pure light gladdens. And over the sonorous water pass iridescent dragonflies, radiant, nimble, with crystalline wings. Listen, the cicada sings, because she loves the sun, sifting down its gold dust through the wood's thick leaves. Mother Earth breathes on us a sigh fecund with the soul of the calyxes and the aroma of the herbs. A bird is in that nest, see? There are two, the male and female. She has a white breast, he has black feathers. In their throat, a warble, the wings soft and fluttering, and the beaks bumping like kissing lips. The nest is a canticle. The bird incubates song. Oh, poets, the bird plucks one chord of the universal lyre. Blessed be the sacred heat that caused the yolks to hatch, oh my love, in the sweet season of spring.
My sweet muse Delight brought me a Greek amphora engraved in alabaster, full of the wine from Naxos, and a lovely cup of gold, the base of it pearl swollen, so I would drink the wine that is proper for poets. On the amphora is Diana, royal, proud, and lithesome, with her divine nudity, and in her synergetics attitude. And on the luminous cup is the Cytherean Venus, reclining by Adonis, who disdains her caresses. I want no wine from Naxos, nor the amphora with lovely handles, nor the cup where Lady Cyprus pleads with the dapper Adonis. I want to sip at love only in your wine-red mouth, oh my love, in the sweet season of spring.
Fate. How fortunate the tree that is scarcely aware, and more so the hard stone, because it no longer feels, since there is no greater pain than the pain of living, nor deeper sorrow than conscious life. Being and knowing nothing, and being without a true course, and the fear of having been, and a future terror, and the certain dread of being dead tomorrow, and suffering because of life, and because of shadow, and because of what we don't know and scarcely suspect, and the flesh that tempts with its fresh-picked bunches, and the tomb that awaits with its funeral bouquets, and not knowing where we are going, nor from where we have come.
El poema que acaba de leer el compañero era Lo Fatal, en inglés, y ahora lo vamos a leer en español. Dichoso el árbol, que es apenas sensitivo, y más la piedra dura, porque esa ya no siente. Pues no hay dolor más grande que el dolor de ser vivo, y mayor pesadumbre que la vida consciente. Ser y no saber nada, y ser sin rumbo cierto, y el temor de haber sido, y un futuro terror, y el espanto seguro de estar mañana muerto, y sufrir por la vida, y por la sombra, y por lo que no conocemos y apenas sospechamos, y la carne que tienta con sus frescos racimos, y la tumba que aguarda con sus fúnebres ramos, y no saber a dónde vamos, ni saber de dónde venimos.
Bueno, buenas noches. Primero, mi agradecimiento a la embajadora de Nicaragua por su invitación. Ahora lo voy a decir en español, luego veremos si somos capaces de ir al inglés mío, que es un poco raro. Realmente es una reunión bilingüe, pero yo voy a hablar en inglés, pero tengo que empezar en español. Muchísimas gracias por la invitación. Es un gran honor estar aquí en este centenario para pensar en Rubén, en lo que dio al mundo, lo que fue para tantos poetas, y también me referiré a su influencia en la poesía española. Pero para mí es un honor, realmente es una felicidad, porque Rubén fue uno de mis primeros poetas en castellano, con la ayuda de un diccionario y con un gran profesor que vive todavía, que es Donald Shaw, en Dublín, en Trinity College, que fue mi primer profesor de español y también de algún amigo aquí. Y fue Donald Shaw quien me introdujo en el mundo, para mí, extraordinario de Rubén Darío, todo un descubrimiento. Mi agradecimiento a la embajada, a la embajadora y a los diplomáticos, a nuestro Federico Trillo, el embajador de España aquí, otros embajadores, creo que está el embajador de Chile. Chile fue tan importante para Rubén. Bueno, en fin, es una gran concurrencia de amigos, de amigas, de diplomáticos, de autoridades, de amantes de poesía, algún irlandés, algún inglés, una mezcla. Somos una mezcla. Y me imagino que todo el mundo aquí tiene conocimientos de ambos idiomas. Yo tengo que confesar que creía que iba a dar esta conferencia en español. Y la culpa fue mía, no voy a culpar a nadie, la culpa fue mía. Y descubrí hace 15 días que la conferencia había que darla en el idioma inglés. Ha sido un poco un trastorno, porque yo vivo Rubén intensamente en castellano, como es lógico. Llevo años y décadas leyendo a Rubén. Y lo pienso en español, de modo que si digo algunas tonterías, les ruego que tengan paciencia conmigo y con mi inglés un poco raro, ¿no? Traduciendo. Son dos idiomas que comparten muchas cosas, pero que luego son muy diferentes. El inglés, con esta mezcla de latín, de francés y de alemán, tiene registros extraordinarios, ¿no? Estuve hablando con mi mujer el otro día de esto, y salió una frase: the words we use, words are alemán, use es latín. Este vocabulario, medio latín, francés, medio alemán y tal, creo que da muchos registros al inglés que no tiene ningún otro idioma. En fin, son dos idiomas muy diferentes. Pues muchísimas gracias. Es un placer, una satisfacción y un honor estar aquí esta noche. Now, I'm going to try to move over into Dublin English. And I've written a lecture. It's a lecture in the etymological sense. I like to improvise, but I felt it had to be written. So I am going to have to read this lecture. I'll break away from it from time to time. And it's mainly in English. Well, I am very grateful indeed, as I've said, to be here this evening. Rubén is a great poet, and he's a great poet who's not known enough in the English-speaking world. I went into Waterstones this morning in South Kensington Street, I think it's called, South Kensington, and I said to the lady, "Could you tell me what you've got on Rubén Darío?" And she more or less said, "You what?" I said, Rubén Darío, Darío, D-A-R-I-O-R-U-B-E-N. And she looked it up and said, "Well, I could get you one in a few weeks, but there's nothing in English." And it does seem that there aren't many translations of Rubén circulating in English. I think this is a terrible situation. It's also true that there aren't many translations of Antonio Machado circulating in English. And other poets who ought to be well known in England and in English and aren't. People like Pedro Salinas or Jorge Guillén, Gerardo Diego. Only Lorca from that generation is really known. And this is a pretty dismal state of affairs, and we'll see if anything can be done about it. If Rubén Darío had never been born, it would have been necessary to invent him. Such was the impact of his poetry in the South America and Spain of his time. And such is the power still of his best work. I say best work because his bread and butter, his garbanzos, from beginning to end, came from his newspaper columns. A lot of them, but not all by any means, of only relative interest today. While much of his verse was occasional, commissioned by political leaders and dashed off for the corresponding celebration, he had no private means, no legacy came his way, and it was the newspapers and magazines that fed him, not always very well, especially La Nación, the great Buenos Aires daily, the most important in Spanish-speaking South America. He also picked up one or two posts along the way as an ad hoc diplomat, but they never came with much in the way of a steady or decent income. It was Mamá la Nación, as he called it, Mami la Nación, that financed him while he penned the hundreds of chronicles grouped later in little books such as La Caravana Pasa, Peregrinaciones, España Contemporánea, which is incredibly interesting, which didn't make him much money either, but today, ironically, are fetching high prices in second-hand book market. Rubén then knew what he was talking about when he wrote wittily, Una oda solo es buena de un billete de banco al dorso escrita. The only worthwhile ode is the ode written on the back of a bank note. Not a check, because checks can bounce, on a banknote. Darío was the very first poet I read in Spanish at the age of 18, as I said, thanks to the prompting at Trinity College of Donald Shaw, and with the aid of a dictionary and a grammar book. I didn't know then, nor I suspected anyone else, not even Donald Shaw, that Rubén was the poet who most influenced the incipient Federico García Lorca. I would say that without Rubén Darío, the Lorca we've got would be different. He would have been different had he not come into contact with Rubén's poetry just at that point when he was trying to feel his way, searching. He knew he had a poetical gift, and suddenly he came into contact with Rubén's work. It was a devastating impact, and I'd like to talk a little bit about that later on. It took me a long time to understand, as a very green student, aged 18, trying to understand about literature. It took me a very long time to understand about those mysterious things, literary influences, constantly on the lips of my university lecturers, but never explained. Literary influences. So-and-so was influenced by so-and-so. I think I now grasp a little more about them. No poetry emerges from a vacuum, ex nihilo. Potential poets are galvanized, and it almost always happens of necessity when they are young, even very young, by encountering a kindred poetical spirit whom they feel sure indicates the path to follow. Already peculiarly sensitive to the words of the tribe, arranged in verse, rhythm, and song, they have been waiting for a guiding light. In the case of Rubén, the guiding light above all was Victor Hugo. In the case of Lorca, it was Rubén Darío. But let me isolate the vital biographical facts of Rubén's early life as I see them. He was born in 1867 and, in default of a stable home background, brought up in the town of León by a relative of his mother and her soldier husband. Like James Joyce and so many other outstanding writers, he was educated by the Jesuits, who gave him a lifelong love of Latin, both liturgical and classical, a smattering of Greek, and a strong dislike of the God of the Old Testament. Not of Jesus Christ, though, for whom he would retain his admiration and fluctuating allegiance until the end of his days. Rubén came into the world, he said over and over again, to worship woman, art, and beauty with capital letters, and to express his passion for them in verse. He not only accomplished his mission, but became the most persuasive and persistent advocate in the Spanish language of carpe diem, gather ye rosebuds while ye may, of enjoying the day and trusting as little as possible to the future. Can anyone here think of a possible competitor? I'd be happy to make a note if that were the case. Ruben returns to the theme again and again in his poems, from the earliest to the last, and with increasing despair as he gets older. Sometimes the expression is rather banal. Amar, reír, la vida es corta, gozar de abril es lo que importa. But at his best, the message is expressed with power and a sense of compelling urgency. I suppose there is hardly anyone in the Spanish-speaking world who doesn't know the opening lines of Canción de Otoño en Primavera or Autumnal Song in Springtime. Juventud, divino tesoro, ya te vas para no volver. Cuando quiero llorar, no lloro, y a veces lloro sin querer. His own springtime of love was marred by the, for him, terrible discovery that his first partner, Rosario Murillo, whom he had an intense teenage relationship with, was not the virgin he had imagined. He ended it in true macho fashion when the terrible truth emerged and left the country. A few years later, he married someone else, but before long, she died, and Rosario then returned with a vengeance. One day, when he was suitably drunk, she inveigled him into her bed with her military officer brother waiting in the wings, armed with a revolver and accompanied by an acquiescent priest. All went according to plan. The said revolver was brandished, and Ruben was bullied into marrying her virtually there and then. When he came to, it was too late. He soon got away, but Rosario was to plague him until the end of his days. The urge to get away, to be on the move, was already there at any rate, in his blood. He had what he considered an atavistic need to travel, and he loved to quote the famous saying attributed by Plutarch to Pompey, navigare necesse, vivere non est necesse. Setting sail or setting off is what counts, not living. He even came to feel that he was a poetical reincarnation of Jason the Argonaut, the mythical adventurer who sailed to the confines of the known world in search of the Golden Fleece. Por atavismo griego o por fenicia influencia, siempre he sentido en mí ansia de navegar. Y Jasón me ha legado su sublime experiencia y el sentir en mi vida los misterios del mar, the mysteries of the sea. There is a port on the Pacific coast of Nicaragua called Corinth. As a child, Ruben loved the place, with its mangrove swamps teeming with birds and the boats arriving from and leaving for Europe. And its name, Corinth, could not fail to stimulate his imagination. He imagined that the ships from the Nicaraguan Corinth sometimes made their way to the Greek one. Perhaps they did sometimes. Moreover, was it not at the Battle of Lepanto in the Bay of Corinth, the Greek one, that Cervantes had lost his arm? And had not Cervantes created in Don Quixote the greatest adventurer of them all? Atavistic urge or not, Darío was fated to be a wanderer, a lifelong wanderer or pilgrim, in search of his particular dream, although ironically, he never made it to Greece. And of course, as you've said, we are celebrating Cervantes this year as well, and Shakespeare. I am actually rereading Don Quixote at the moment. I have to say, it is the greatest book. It is really the greatest book. I think that if Don Quixote didn't exist, well, obviously one would have to invent it. But really, Spain, I think, justifies its existence by having produced somebody who produced Don Quixote. It is the most amazing book. And the word adventure, I've noticed, is on every page. Adventures, setting out on an adventure. Well, what could be better? And this is surely one of the greatest books, and we're celebrating the book as well. So this is a big year for celebrations. Shakespeare and Cervantes and Rubén, of course. Talking again of atavism, we must also take into account the profound sense of the mystery of existence, which Rubén attributed in part to the drops of indigenous and Indian blood pulsating in his veins. In his moving obituary of the poet, his friend, the austere philosopher Miguel de Unamuno, temperamentally very different, came up with a telling phrase. Rubén, he insisted, the deep down Rubén, the superstitious Chorotegan Indian in Rubén, quote, would tremble in the presence of the mysterious like the foliage of a tree lashed by the north wind. Unamuno knew his man and had probably heard Rubén speculating about the life beyond the veil and even relating his encounters with the occasional ghost or apparition. Rubén came to believe that the business of the authentic poet, as distinct from the gifted versifier, is to interrogate the arcana of the world, or as he put it on another occasion, to draw close to the gates of mystery and to return with a glimmer of the unknown in the eyes. Asomarse a las puertas del misterio y volver de él con una vislumbre de lo desconocido en los ojos. Getting back to Victor Hugo, he was the great formative influence on Rubén, who read him not in Spanish translation, but in the original French. Where did he get his French from? The rudiments, no doubt, at school. But he felt that in some strange way he had come into the world, atavism again, with an innate flair for the language. This was confirmed when he began to read Hugo. It just came naturally to him. He had an innate feeling for the language. It wasn't just a question of the immense energy of the master, of his amazing range of subject matter, but also of a close identification with his message, with the essential message of Hugo. That is, the need for sincerity above all else, and for the courage to search for one's own way in life and art, to cast off as far as possible the strictures imposed by society, to do it one's own way. Rubén never forgot, I believe, the preface to Hugo's Cromwell, with its revolutionary clarion call in 1827 to take up the arms of Romanticism. Perhaps he inwardly digested, above all, one famous passage when Hugo says, "Let us then speak out boldly. The time for it is ripe, and it would be strange if in this age freedom, like the light, should penetrate everywhere except to the one place in the world where freedom is most natural, the domain of thought. Let us take the hammer to theories and poetic systems. Let us throw down the old plasterwork that conceals the facade of art. There are neither rules nor models, or rather, there are no other rules than the general laws of nature, which hold good for the whole field of art, and the special rules which result from the conditions appropriate to the subject of each composition." I think those words sunk deep into the mind of Rubén Darío. I don't think he ever forgot those words. Hugo taught him that the primary task of the budding poet is to search for and eventually to find his own authentic voice. But how? He began to discover it in Chile, thanks to his friend Pedro Balmaceda, the son of the President of the Republic. Dreamy, affable, neurotic, destined to die young, Balmaceda not only admired Hugo passionately, but also contemporary French literature in general. He even had a column in a Chilean paper entitled News from Paris, Noticias de París, which he signed with a suitably Gallic pseudonym. According to Rubén, his chronicles were so convincing that his readers assumed that he was a native French writer with perhaps a Chilean mother. Balmaceda had never set foot in Paris, let alone France, but his nostalgia for the city, as he termed it, was so strong that it was as if he had come into the world in the Quartier Latin. Together they read Hugo, imbibing Les Orientales, and the Chansons des rues et des bois. They marveled at the fact that Hugo was capable of evoking the Alhambra in convincing and brilliant detail when he had never set foot in Spain, or the Nicaraguan priest-swallowing volcano of Momotombo. You must tell me about Momotombo. Is it still swallowing priests? Yes, it had a thing about priests. Hugo had written about Momotombo, which I longed to see without ever having crossed the Atlantic. But Balmaceda and Ruben didn't limit their reading to the Colossus, to Hugo. They were also deep into other contemporary French writers. Catulle Mendes, for example, with his risqué Parisian short stories, Flaubert, and of course, and perhaps above all, the Baudelaire of Les Fleurs du Mal. We in this country, in Britain, need to remember the tremendous breakthrough achieved by France with Madame Bovary and Les Fleurs du Mal in that year, 1857. Britain was puritanical. It was the Victorian era. But neither of those books could have been published in this country. And Spain was almost as stuffy at the time. And the poetry of the day was conventional, boring, and bourgeois to a degree. Gaspar Núñez de Arce, Ramón de Campoamor, compared to Baudelaire, they were mere superficial poetasters. Even Beckett seemed lightweight by comparison. Ruben, sensing that he was on the right track, began to imitate Mendes and Armand Silvestre. Soon, proceeding with a lucidity and a self-confidence extraordinary in such a young writer, not even 20, he was publishing short stories that departed decisively from the sort of thing being done in Spanish on both sides of the Atlantic. His aim, he said later, was to attempt to convey in his native language some of the melodic nuance he had discovered in French. Could not Spanish poetry relinquish its recurrent tendency to indulge in what he called fogosidades? Fogosidades, a lovely word, from fuego, of course. Overheated effusions, how could one translate fogosities? Fogosidades. And search for a more subtle mode of expression capable of giving voice to the fleeting promptings of the mind, those ideas indecisas, so common yet so difficult to pin down. Could Spanish poetry, he asked, not aim at suggesting, following the formulation of Mallarmé, suggérer, voilà le rêve, instead of stating? Such a revolution could not be carried through, he felt sure, in the motherland, in Spain, la madre patria, so hidebound by tradition and convention. It had to be America. And he recalled later, and that's how, thinking in French and writing in Spanish, I published the little book that sparked off the current literary movement in America, from which, if José María de Heredia is right, will spring the mental revolution of Spain. The little book was Azul, published in Chile in 1888, a mere handful of poems and cuentos expanded in later editions. Its first section, El Año Lírico, with its 4 poems corresponding respectively to each of the seasons, made a huge impact. Ruben was careful to send a copy of the little volume to the famous Spanish novelist and critic Juan Valera, who had an influential column in one of Spain's leading cultural supplements, the Madrid Los Lunes de El Imparcial. Valera didn't let him down. He was amazed by the book. Despite its obvious debt to France, particularly to Victor Hugo, he had perceived at once that it was no mere pastiche. You possess a remarkable and strange originality, he wrote. He didn't think any poet in Spain capable of such a feat, given that all Spaniards, including himself, were so rootedly Spanish that even stretched on the rack, they would be incapable of abjuring their origins. Ni a 24 tirones, ningún español iba a abandonar su condición de español. Y muy bien, además. That was the first thing. Nobody in Spain could have done it. As regards the 4 poems comprising El Año Lírico, Valera was unerring. Your feeling for nature verges on pantheistic adoration, he said. The article was couched as a letter to Ruben. Each of them reads like a sacred hymn to Eros. We've heard one of them, very fascinating English version of Primaveral, and I'll come back to that. Each of them reads like a sacred hymn to Eros. To Eros, and I would add, to his mother. To his mother, the goddess of love, Aphrodite, born as her name states, Aphrodite, born of the spume of the sea. And to Pan, god of the wilds, shepherds and flocks, terror of nymphs and hamadryads. And an occasional human female, I should think, too. The first poem of El Año Lírico, which we've been listening to, shows how right Valera was about sacred hymns to Eros. And I would like to comment on it briefly. I think you did a wonderful job reading that translation. Terribly difficult to translate Primaveral into English that works. I thought it was remarkable. Extremely interesting how you did it. Thank you very much. But the poem it constitutes technically a remarkable renovation of the traditional Spanish ballad or romance. That is to say, the octosyllabic ballad with vowel rhyme or assonance on the even lines, whose history the poet and critic Pedro Salinas has written, is almost the history of Spanish literature itself. Oh my goodness, has the microphone been wrong all the time? Have you not heard a word I've been saying? Oh, this is terrible.
Yeah, can you start again?
Oh, should have said something earlier. Oh dear, I hope it wasn't too bad. Anyway, about the Spanish romance. It's an octosyllabic ballad with vowel rhyme or assonance on the even lines, whose history, Pedro Salinas, the poet and critic, has said, is almost the history of Spanish literature itself. Somebody else has said it comes the closest to the rhythm of Spanish conversation. I mean, a ballad can almost sound like straightforward conversation. And what I don't know is how Ruben came to write this poem as a romance, because the other three of the series are in a mixture of 11 and 7-syllable lines. Whatever the reason, I don't think that any previous Spanish ballad ever intoned with the fervor of Primaveral, this spring poem, a carpe diem, at once so uninhibited and so imbued with pagan sentiment. The pagan sentiment that Valera immediately recognized. This is Ruben, the exuberant daytime atheist. I think that comes from Brendan Behan in Dublin, if I'm not mistaken. A daytime atheist, as opposed to Ruben, the anxiety-ridden Catholic insomniac he was to become. It's all very well when the sun is shining, but by night in the early hours, it's not quite the same picture. This is the first poem I deciphered in Spanish, and I still think it quite extraordinary from every point of view. I mean, even the three-word verbless opening was in its way revolutionary, Mes de Rosas. I mean, I could almost do that myself, and I'm not a poet. Month of Roses, you can't get simpler. Ruben's hymn to Eros is set in a wood explicitly equated with a love temple. El gran bosque es nuestro templo, allí ondea y flota un santo perfume de amor. The great wood is our temple. In it floats and lingers the sacred incense of love. Where is the wood located? We are mistaken that if we start off by imagining it to be in Nicaragua. After the oak trees have done obeisance to the beloved, we are transported to ancient Greece, to a grove where naked nymphs frolic in a fountain emerging from a cave and intone love songs in the language of Homer, which the narrator tells us was invented by the god Pan, which is really stretching things too far. The narrator professes to know Greek too, and promises to use it to emulate the nymphs in singing the praises of his mistress. Clearly, we are expected to suspend some of our disbelief. After the evocation of the locus amenus, with the rising sap of its vegetation, its pollen, its bees, cicadas and dragonflies, its nests full of eggs about to burst open, and its urgent invitation to participate in the spring ritual. The poet describes the beautiful amphora, brimful of wine from the island of Naxos, with which he has just been regaled by his muse, aptly designated Delicia. The amphora is decorated with a relief of Diana the Huntress and is accompanied by a gold cup with a depiction of Venus lying beside a disdainful Adonis. The gift is appropriate, but the poet is fully occupied with the business in hand, and his rejection, rounded off by the poem's final ritornello, is emphatic, as we've heard. No quiero el vino de Naxos, ni el ánfora de asas bellas, ni la copa donde Cipria al gallardo Adonis ruega. Quiero beber el amor solo en tu boca bermeja. Amada ven, es el dulce tiempo de la primavera. I couldn't translate this. I did a rendering. It's not quite the rendering you read, but it means more or less, doesn't it? I don't want the wine from Naxos, nor the amphora with pretty handles, nor the cup with Cyprian Venus imploring the handsome Adonis. It's love I want to drink, love only, straight from your rosy mouth. Come, my darling, sweet spring is here. Forgive me for insisting that nothing like this had ever been heard before in Spanish. No wonder that Juan Valera was flabbergasted when, all unannounced, Azul landed on his desk in Madrid. Azul was published 5 years before Rubén finally made it to Paris in the summer of 1893. They were to prove the two most intense months in his life. Paris didn't disappoint him. How could it? It lived up to all his expectations. It thrilled him. Men and women treated each other as equals, it seemed. Sex wasn't taboo. Its literary and artistic life was unparalleled in the world, and of course, being Paris, there were plenty of alluring ladies to hand. In Paris, he would write, the word shame, pudor, has no place whatsoever, because here something special circulates in the air, and the Parisienne brings to the capital of pleasure her unique, singular, and overwhelming magic. Ah, la Parisienne! Her laughter, her gaiety, her insouciance. Later Darío would come to see the other sordid side of life in the French capital, but not yet. In Paris, he established contact immediately with two young writers and confirmed bohemians who acted as his guides and initiators, the Guatemalan Enrique Gómez Carrillo, who had been living there for 2 years, and the Sevillano Alejandro Saua, afterwards immortalized by Valle Inclán in Luces de Bohemia as Max Estrella, the protagonist of the play. It was too late to meet Hugo, who had died 8 years earlier, but Saua, who had attended the great man's multitudinous funeral, was able to introduce Darío to his other hero, and the other hero, of course, was Paul Verlaine, whose Poème Saturnien and Fête Galante he had internalized in Buenos Aires. That evening, in his favorite cafe, and surrounded by the usual crowd of hangers-on, Verlaine was drinking absinthe and already half drunk. Maestro, said Saua, this is Rubén Darío, a South American poet who wants to meet you and greatly admires you. Rubén mumbled a few eulogistic phrases, ending with a reference to La Gloire. Verlaine stared at him with glazed eyes and, tapping irritably on the table, replied in a low voice, La gloire? La gloire? La gloire? Merde! Merde la gloire! Merde! Merde! Merde encore! Verlaine was to die 4 years later in the most abject poverty. Darío would remember him not only in a wonderful elegy, Responsa, but in a remarkable obituary piece. The great poet he wrote there was riven between belief and disbelief, spirit and flesh engaged in permanent civil war. His close identification with Verlaine, Rubens, was evident for anyone with eyes to see. He wrote of Verlaine, of the three enemies of the soul, the one who did him least damage was the world. The devil attacked him, but resorting to prayer, he defended himself against him as best he could. But the flesh was indomitable and implacable. Rarely has the serpent of sexuality attacked the human brain with more fury and poison. He was an eternal prisoner of desire. As he walked, you could almost see the marks left by a cloven hoof. And as his lasciviousness increased, so too did his Catholic conception of guilt. Ruben, not surprisingly, returned to South America in a state of high excitement. He had met Verlaine, he had frequented the night spots and the day spots. He had enjoyed the company of several Parisiennes. He had acquired a caseful of fascinating books. He had improved his French, taken on board 1,000 anecdotes. Back home, he set to work immediately on the series of pen portraits, first published in La Nación, which were to make up the volume Los Raros, published in Buenos Aires in 1896, the year of Verlaine's death, and in Barcelona in 1905. The Raros, the choice of adjective was a trouvaille, a corazonada, were some 20 mainly French contemporary writers who had impressed him by dint of their eccentricity, extreme individualism, and determination to live their lives free as possible from external pressures. Among them, along with Verlaine, were Villiers de l'Isle-Adam, Jean Rispin, Lecomte de Lille, Madame Rachilde, author of a scandalous novel, Monsieur Vénus, Isidore Ducasse, the self-styled Comte de Lautréamont, and a sprinkling of foreign fellow spirits such as Edgar Allan Poe Ibsen and the Portuguese Eugenio de Castro. Almost miraculously, Ruben had happened upon a copy of Lautréamont's Les Chants de Mal d'Aurore in a second-hand bookshop by the Seine. The volume was totally forgotten, had been totally forgotten, was absolutely unique in the annals of French 19th century literature, both for the startling originality of its style and its virulent hatred of the biblical God. Its beautiful as comparisons greatly impressed Darío. He quotes some of them in Los Raros. For example, the Virginian eagle owl, beautiful as a thesis on the curve described by a dog running after its master, swooped down into the crevices of a ruined convent. The eagle owl, beautiful as a thesis on the curve described by a dog running after its master, swooped down into the crevices of a ruined convent. Another one, the beetle, Escarabajo, the beetle, beautiful as the trembling of the hands in alcoholism. And the most arresting of them all, the adolescent, beautiful as the chance meeting on a dissecting table of a sewing machine and an umbrella. Not bad for 1827. Yeah. Ruben had never come across anything like that before, and it seemed to him impossible, unthinkable, that the book's enigmatic author, who had died penniless in Paris in 1846 at the age of 24, was not already considered a giant of French literature. More than 20 years were to pass before Les Chants de Mal d'Aurore was rediscovered by André Breton and the Surrealists, who immediately elevated it to the status it deserved. And almost needless to say, they were unaware that a young Nicaraguan poet had got there first in a book they had never heard of, called Los Raros. What Darío wrote about Lautréamont in Los Raros would not be lost on Lorca, who began to write in 1916, a month after Ruben's death, and whose early work is shot through with direct and indirect reference to him and his poetry. Yes, I am back to influences, and I must now round off these remarks by referring more closely, if you will allow me, to Darío's impact on the future author of the Gypsy Ballads and Blood Wedding. To start with, almost all the poets of the so-called generation of 1927 were in debt to Ruben in one way or another and had internalized many of his poems. Damaso Alonso liked to recall his first encounter with Darío's verse in Medinaceli in the summer of 1915 and the huge impression it made on him, the novelty of his voice, his musicality, the colors, his passionate cult of art and beauty. They were unlike anything he had come across before, a revelation, an invitation, an incitation, a festival of new sensations. He considered that what Rubén brought to contemporary poetry was similar in impact to that of the Italianate innovations in the 16th century, visible above all in the poetry of Garcilaso de la Vega. Jorge Guillén told me that he and his fellow poets even enjoyed Rubén's verbal excesses and his occasional bad taste. Such was their admiration for the man and the poet. Even his purer verses or his sometimes unhappy rhymes, they loved them. They thought they were fascinating. That is an indication of the fascination of the man and the influence he exerted over them. Of the whole group, Lorca was undoubtedly the most affected. In an early article, Rules in Music, Las Reglas en la Música, his admiration is explicit. Rubén, he says there, hated the pedants, the stodgy critics, the musty academicians, and the sticklers for rules and regulations. So does he. Rules in music are useless, he wrote, especially when we are talking about a genius such as Strauss. And the same holds true for all the arts and for poetry. Rubén el Magnífico, Rubén the Magnificent, arrived, and at his sight the conventional academic versifiers took to their heels. Rubén el Magnífico. The young Lorca was imbued with Darío. And we know from his library, what remains of his library, that he had probably all the volumes that came out in 1916, 1917, at Rubén's death. He repeats the epithet Rubén el Magnífico in what appears to have been his very first poem, whose versification, moreover, and manner are an obvious debt to prosas profanas. He admired Rubén's scorn for the Philistines, his disregard for conventional notions of poetic decorum, his refusal to be classified as belonging to this or that school, his faith in art, his individualism, as when he said, mi literatura es mía en mí, Rubén. Mi literatura es mía en mí. His allegiance among the gods to Eros and Aphrodite, his intellectual curiosity, his astonishing creative energy, his capacity for admiration, his pantheistic fervor, his sincerity, his rejection of the God of the Old Testament, and his fervent allegiance to Jesus, the friend of the halt and the lame. And Lorca, the young Lorca, shared Rubén's terror of death and his sense of the deep mystery of life. Perhaps it was Darío's attempt to effect a synthesis of the pagan and the Christian that had most relevance for him, struggling as he was against the shame and guilt generated by a religion obsessed with the sins of the flesh. That this was so is confirmed by the prologue to his first book, Impresiones y Paisajes, Impressions and Landscapes, in which he insists on the need to be both religious and profane, to combine the mysticism of a severe Gothic cathedral with the wonder of pagan Greece. There is no doubt that he had in mind Darío's extraordinary poem Divina Psychis, in which the poet likens his soul to a butterfly flitting between pagan ruins and a medieval cathedral. For the young Lorca, attempting to come to terms with his uncertain sexuality in a city as retrograde as Granada, Darío came as a profound consolation and as a guide. To cap it all, he cannot have been indifferent to the fact that Rubén had visited the Alhambra, fulfilling a childhood dream, and that looking across to the Albaicín had pondered on the fate of the city in 1492. Impressions recorded in his book of articles, Tierras Solares, with which the young Lorca was almost certainly familiar because Manuel de Falla had a copy in his library, and Falla was by then a very close friend of Lorca, and they were collaborating on various projects. Poets don't always acknowledge publicly their debts or their debt to those who've gone before them. They tend to be secretive about it. Lorca was to a considerable extent an exception. We have seen some of the explicit references to Rubén in his early work. There are many, many more. In 1934 in Buenos Aires, he participated with Pablo Neruda in an act of fervent homage to the poet. Darío had traveled around Spain, he said, as if it were his native country, and with an admirable sense of universality and generosity, had imparted to her poets, old and young, the good news of the liberating movement he had initiated in America. Despite his occasional lapses, Lorca said, the fecund substance of his great poetry remains intact. Ruben knew by 1916 that modernismo had run its course. The nymphs had departed, leaving no addresses, and the princesses and other aristocratic participants in his Versaillesque fête galante, so indebted to Verlaine, had gone too. The signs were all about him as the Great War raged on with its millions of dead and the new horror of poison gas. But he had done his work well, igniting vocations and enthusiasms, launching an all-out attack on the rigidities of an exhausted poetic language, as Sergio Ramirez wrote the other day in El País, stressing the need for sincerity and every so often creating poems which have survived the test of time and which will continue to do so. Poems such as Le Fatal, which it was wonderful to hear in English, which we have also listened to this evening. A poem, by the way, considered, I gather, by Gabriel García Márquez as one of the greatest in the Spanish language. Poems which justify Antonio Machado's comment, written a year after Ruben's death, that if prosas profanas confirmed him as the incomparable master of form and sensation, in Cantos de Vida y Esperanza, he revealed 10 years later the very depths of his soul. His last compositions, written in New York just before returning to Nicaragua to die, show that he was now fully aware of the terrible suffering in the world, most of it man-made. And what is perhaps even more poignant is that in their impassioned condemnation of a dehumanized society sick with materialism, they look forward to those written in the North American metropolis 14 years later by Lorca in Poeta en Nueva York. Rubén Darío, whose first surname was García, another coincidence, and the author of Yerma and Blood Wedding, are indissolubly linked. It is a fact which I am not ashamed to admit fills me with the deepest personal satisfaction. Thank you very much. Muchísimas gracias. Muchísimas gracias, queridos amigos. Muchísimas gracias. Ha sido para mí un placer inmenso estar aquí. Gracias.